Hello and welcome to the seventh live broadcast. If you can hear me, then you may want to just say hello into the chat pod, so that I know that I'm not talking to myself this month. Okay, so I'm going to share the screen. So just you'll see my screen appear in just a minute or two. Okay, so thank you, Cheryl, for letting me know that somebody's online. Okay, so hopefully you can see an image of an FE35mm f1.8. There's been a lot of Sony news in the last few days. It's all been keeping me very, very busy. I created a blog post about this lens on my website, www.markgaylor.com. I haven't had a chance to get a hands-on a review of this lens yet, so look, it's not going to be one of the things that I'm hanging out to try. I know it's a very popular request that Sony basically release a 1.8 35mm, and the pleasing thing is, for many people, it's not branded as a Zeiss or a G or a GM lens, so it fits into that mold of the 50mm f1.8, the 85 1.8, which is one of my favorite lenses, and also the 28mm f2. So it's a little bit pricier than those lenses, and some people wondered why that lens was just a little bit more expensive. And I suspect it's to do with the fact that Sony has started putting in linear motors for very fast AF. Obviously, a lot of the recent developments in the Sony cameras, the AF tracking of these lenses and cameras is just getting faster and faster. So Sony are building lenses that can keep up with their cameras, basically. Okay, so let's moving along to the other major release. Now, a lot of people often ask me, do I know when a camera is coming out? And the answer is almost certainly no, I don't. Sony run a very tight ship. They don't release information above and beyond those people who absolutely need to know. So if you haven't been handpicked as one of the 3 or 4 photographers who will have a pre-release camera to start shooting, then none of the other photographers or ambassadors actually know. Now, a lot of people will be invited over to the press event in New York, which happened to coincide with a midnight release here in Australia, and those people would have had a hands-on following that event. And again, I wasn't in New York, so I watched the live stream with pretty much every other alpha user to work out what was being released. Now, I wrote up a preview from the spec sheet. Sony Australia sent me the information about this new camera about 10 minutes past midnight, and then I proceeded to write up a blog post, which I released at that 2 hours later. And then I spent the next day with very little sleep writing up a preview movie in order to release that, and I put that onto my blog post as well. Now, later that afternoon, I actually got a phone call to say that Sony Australia would be delivering this camera to me. So even though the preview, I didn't actually have the camera, I now have the camera now, and I am working my way through creating a review, an extended review. Again, some people on social forums basically say, what do you think of it, Mark? Are you going to upgrade or whatever? And again, I think that I'm reluctant to answer those questions, because the answer is possibly going to be over half an hour long. It's a bit like when I reviewed the 200-600mm lens. Some people wanted just to know whether it was better than the 100-400 and should they go out and buy it. And the answer is a little bit more complicated. It's specialist gear fits in nicely with some people, but not all photographers. And obviously the A7R Mark IV is a very specialist camera. Okay, and I can talk about that now just for a little while. I will be creating a review, but I'll put out some of my thoughts in this live seminar now. Now, obviously, it is the resolution, and when people look at my preview and then start commenting, you don't need that many megapixels, well, it is the resolution camera. And so, of course, Sony are going to work out if they can add more resolution without compromising dynamic range, high ISO performance, focus performance. And if they think they can get away with it, then of course they'll add more resolution, because one of the important commercial cameras out there is the medium format camera. Larger sensors, and Sony typically makes all of the sensors for these medium format cameras, but high resolution. And some photographers, especially commercial photographers doing maybe studio advertising, do actually need that extra resolution. For photographers myself, I actually like the idea of a higher resolution when I need to crop very aggressively. I don't print that large very often, although I have been requested to create some 7 feet tall prints off my review of this camera, which are going to be unveiled in Singapore. I'm being flown over to Singapore at the end of the month to showcase this camera, and they'll have some 5-7 foot high prints. So obviously I am going to be using the resolution in that instance. But I'm more interested in, if I was going to add this camera to my own workflow, I'm more interested in how it will perform as a general purpose camera that does allow me to crop aggressively. So instead of maybe carrying a 200-600 lens, I could just maybe carry my 100-400 lens, shoot in APS-C mode, or just crop more aggressively in post-production. So I've got a couple of slides there just to show you how much croppability, I don't know whether that's a word, but I'm going to use that, croppability we have with an A7R Mark IV camera. Now, obviously, it's higher in resolution than the 50 megapixel medium format cameras made by, say, Pentax and Fuji. There are obviously higher resolution medium format cameras out there, over 100 megapixels, but 61 megapixels is certainly a big file. Okay, and you can see in this little diagram here, I'm doing a 4K crop into this A7R4 file, and you can see that we have pixels aplenty in order to make that crop, and yet still have a high quality image that will fill a 4K screen. Now there is a little caveat here, and that is in order to get crisp, ultra sharp detail in that small crop there, you are going to have to be using very, very good glass. Now, Sony have committed a while ago, they did announce that their GM glass was basically being designed for resolutions that of sensors that we hadn't yet seen. And so that's where that really fits in, is if you are going to buy an A7R Mark IV camera and really want to crop really aggressively or print very, very large, you're only really going to get that extra resolution if you also have the companion glass, the GM glass, to go with that. So if you're just running with G lenses or just non-G lenses, say like the new 35 1.8, you aren't guaranteed of actually getting the extra resolution, even though the resolution of the sensor is higher. Another one of the things that I've seen is people posting some of these images early up to social media, which is the maximum resolution of a Facebook post is 2048 pixels. And it's interesting that some people will say, well, that looks really sharp, but remember, you're only seeing like 3 megapixels on that post, and so you really need to be able to access at least a 4K image. And so for those people who have set up Flickr accounts so you can have image reviews as part of this premium service, at least I can look at a 4K image on a 4K monitor to assess the degree of sharpness. Now, what I will probably start doing as part of this review is I'll start uploading, maybe not the full resolution, but I'll certainly start uploading some 8K images, double the 4K. So that means some people could maybe download the image and zoom in to a higher magnification or 1:1 view and look at the detail that is being pulled off this high resolution camera. Okay, so another great interest for photographers may be interested in this is the ability to because some photographers can't get close enough to the subjects they're photographing. They really do want to be able to crop in, either using the camera in APS-C mode. And one of the highlighted features that Sony were really selling at the launch was that the APS-C mode on this camera will be 26.2 megapixels, and that is actually higher than the 24 megapixel sensors such as on the A9 camera. Now, if a bird photographer came to me and said, okay, so would I be better off using the A7R Mark IV rather than my A9 to shoot birds, I'm going to be a little bit cagey on that answer, because they will sacrifice some AF performance. So that the AF performance has got the new tracking feature, but is it an A9, a high resolution A9? No, it's not. It's the resolution camera. So for people like bird photographers who want to be able to crop more aggressively, I would just advise that if you're not happy with the 24 megapixel resolution of your current A9, wait for the A9 II, and that is because I would imagine the resolution of the second version of the A9 will increase. And if anybody's ever used an A9, they really know, especially with the firmware update, this camera is insane when it comes to locking onto a subject and holding on to that subject. I've used the A7R4 on one action shoot, so I don't want to basically give a definitive answer about whether the A7R4 is better at focus tracking than the A7 III or the A7R Mark III, but obviously it's not an A9, and I will be testing it again, but I have noticed dropped images in sequences where it hasn't acquired the subject, and so it's a good focusing camera. But if you're looking for action sports and you want resolution, I would go A9, or just wait for that A9 II to see what that delivers. Okay, so I've got some test shots from I've been pulling off this camera, and you can see that can I just get somebody to just write into the chat pod just to make sure that you can see my screen? If Cheryl, if you're still there, just type in that you're actually seeing these images. I'm just getting a little bit nervous after last month that this is being recorded well after the little hiccup that we experienced. So just okay, Brian, thank you. Hopefully you're both seeing the screen, so you're not seeing a blank screen with me rattling on, because I am showing images now. Okay, thank you, Brian. Okay, so the first outing that I went on with the camera was a full day shoot, probably 5 hours. It was at a place called Sovereign Hill, Ballarat. A lot of the people here, it's a working museum, a working sort of period place. So a lot of the people hovering around this place are used to having their photographs taken, because there's a lot of good character portraits to be had here. And when I talking with people who say, look, I really admire your portraits, but I feel very nervous pointing the camera at complete strangers, I say, well, you know, you can sort of break the ice on this genre if you really want to get into this portraits. And this is one of the events that I actually advise people to go to, is to go to a place where people are used to having their photographs taken, perhaps by tourists. There are other events like Comic-Con, anime festivals, parades where people have spent hours getting dressed up. They really enjoy being photographed, and this can be an enjoyable experience where you lose that nervousness about approaching strangers and asking them, oh, if you could just step over 2 steps to the left, the background will be great, and no, you don't have to smile. Sometimes I have to remind these people I'm photographing, okay, this isn't a selfie, you can just relax. And sometimes it might take a minute or two and chatting with them about what it is they're exactly doing. This guy is working with wood in a machine shop, and so I've talked to him about what he's doing, and then he relaxes, and then I'll ask him maybe to do something with his hand, or just turn slightly towards the light, and then I can get the portrait I want. And one of the reasons I'm shooting vertically in this instance is okay, hi Stephen, hi Oz. One of the reasons that I'm shooting vertically in this instance is simply because Sony in Singapore have actually requested that the 5 images they're going to print 7 feet tall are 16:9 aspect ratio verticals. Now, the vast majority of my portrait work is typically horizontal or landscape, and that's because I come from a sort of an editorial background where a horizontal could be cropped to a vertical for a single page, but it does give the desktop publisher freedom to put an image out over a double page spread, put the text in some of the negative space, and go double page spread on my portraits. So spending most of the day with the camera in vertical orientation is something that I don't do very often. And I don't own a grip for these cameras because I don't have the camera in vertical orientation for much of the time. And with the improved battery life, I just don't need the extra battery in that grip either. So I do, you probably noticed in my ebook for the A7 III, A7R3, I do highlight a grip extension, which is the just somewhere to put your little finger, especially when you're using long lenses. A lot of people commented that was an extraordinarily expensive item from Sony, given that it's over $100. But I wasn't really there to sell the Sony grip extension. I was there just saying for people with larger hands who want more of a firm grip, there are options. Even if they cover the battery cover, you can still get that battery in and out in just 5 seconds with those things. Okay, and some of the cages that are also on offer do allow the battery to be replaced without removing, say, the L bracket or cage. So there are options there for people who would prefer that larger grip. And having said that, the A7R4 does have a larger grip. It has a much bigger grip. It's one of the first things people will notice when they pick up the camera, but it still leaves the little finger on most people's hands floating in midair. I actually don't mind that, to be honest, but I certainly like the grip extension with the larger, heavier lenses, but it's not something that worries me. I have to remind people that I come from using analog cameras in the 1980s and early 1990s that were as small as the A7 cameras, and so I don't actually think I never noticed that was a problem then. And I never used to buy the really big, heavy cameras with the motor drives underneath, and certainly the early digital cameras that had an undercarriage. I actually didn't like carrying the extra weight. Okay, so these are my vertical portraits I'll send off to Singapore. I'm always nervous about how much interesting bokeh background I can get into a vertical, especially a narrow vertical shot. But I think I've succeeded in this image. There's a little bit of a street scene going on there. And it was a sunny day. Well, I'm in winter in Australia here now, so it was a little bit of I was pleased to see the sun, but then when I'm working this location, I don't want full sun on the faces. You'll get the people squinting. So it's always about a question of is if you just walk 5 steps forward, you'll be in the shadow of this building, and I can photograph you here. So I'm never really content to photograph people exactly in situ. I always sort of want to position people. I don't really want them to pose. I just want them to move in a slightly different location, and I'll tend just to walk around them to get the best background. Okay, so this guy has been chatting to me about some furnaces that he's been loading with wood, and so in between conversation, I just basically tell him that we're going to capture this moment because he's got a really interesting face. Sometimes I don't actually ask people if I'm going to take their photograph. They're quite relaxed with me at this point, and I just basically tell them this is going to happen. They do have an opportunity to say no, but very rarely does anyone say no if I've just broken the ice with a little bit of conversation and they know who I am and what I'm doing there. Okay, so some really nice shots, less bokeh in the background here, so I prefer the street one, but a good looking off camera shot. We can see I'm working with the 135 GM. Now, typically I am working close to maximum aperture. The IAF is kicking in really reliably. I'd hesitate to say maybe it doesn't kick in as reliably as in horizontal mode, but I do have a full back position. I don't panic if IAF doesn't kick in. There is always an occasional face for whatever reason the Sony cameras goes, not going to use IAF on that face. And my fallback position is DMF. which I have programmed to the AEL button. And so if IAF doesn't kick in, I just hold down to recall custom hold 1, which brings in the DMF. The camera will focus on the subject, but I need just to make sure the focus is exactly on the eye. So I turn the focus ring, we go into magnify view, and then I can just make sure that eye is crisp, because we are working with a depth of field on this 135 at 1.8 that is exceptionally narrow. And you really don't want to be missing eyes, because if these are printed 7 feet tall, that is going to be really unforgiving in these instances. Okay, so this is quite an interesting shot. Is quite a few people wanting to know what the little white dots were, it's basically snow. Now, obviously, it is midwinter here in Australia, and it does snow in Victoria in midwinter. But what is happening at this location, Sovereign Hill, is they actually just blow snow from snow machines periodically during the day. I thought this was a real godsend for me, because as long as I know that I'm shooting into the light, then that snow is going to be highlighted really well. And you can see again the dynamic range of this A7R4 is working really well. Now, I am working with JPEG, okay, because I can't actually open the raw files from this camera yet, and so I can only do a small amount of post-production. But the dynamic range is certainly supporting from the brightest highlights, because we're shooting into the sun, and just opening up the shadows just a little bit in post, adding maybe half a stop to 1 stop of light over the foreground figure there. Usually by using a radial filter, will pretty much bring the contrast back to what I remember seeing with my eyes. Okay, so I've also taken the lens out for landscape shoots. A lot of you may be familiar with this particular location. It is very local to me, and I do use it as a testing ground for ultra wide angle lenses, and also to teach things like hyperfocal distance and settings for landscape. And the reason for this is because those foreground wooden poles or posts are actually very, very close to the lens, and so I can show the depth of field, and I can show corner performance. Some people, you've got a spinning circle. Ooh, what's that? Okay, so I'm not too sure, Cheryl. Just if somebody else just pops in and says whether that's a global problem or just a local problem for one user. That would be good for me. So Cheryl's experiencing. Okay, so Brian, it's working for me. So Cheryl, you might just want to click on the link again and load it in another page of your web browser. Maybe that's an internet connection thing at your end. Okay, so Brian's getting. So I'll just carry on, and hopefully, Cheryl, you can pick that signal back up. This is being recorded, so if you can't get back in, just this will be available just an hour or so after this finishes. So hopefully we'll pick that back up. Okay, so I'll just carry on. This is, as I said, a shoot with my local scene. Now, there is a graduated filter added at the top over the sky, and I did some localized color correction as well. So it's probably a little bit richer than in real life, but it is a pretty magnificent location. This is now an open museum because it's a very historic pier. I'm standing on the half of the pier that has been preserved and renovated, and we're looking out over thousands of pins that was the extension or the other half of the pier before it fell into disrepair. Okay, so let's just, I finished up yesterday just before sunset with some portrait shoots, and I used my daughter for this one. This is Tegan, and we're actually underneath that pier in this instance, and so we're getting nice soft light. I get to face the opening in between some of the pins, so there's the roof of the pier over her head, and so she's getting very soft light. It's very flattering for for people's complexions if the light is coming directly behind you rather than coming from side. And because we have the cover overhead, we get a nice even light coming in from the side. We don't get dark shadows over the eyes. So this is a particular technique I often teach, is to move people into shade, open shade, but maybe with some sort of cover over the top of the head. It just brings the direction of light slightly lower. Now, I have created a movie called Powerful Portraits, and it's less focused on camera settings and more focused on how I actually get these tight portraits. Now, when I showcase my portrait settings that I've often encouraged people maybe to put into one of the memories on the camera, I do say that's a starting point only. Typically, we're using those wider apertures, and so they're ill-suited for group portraits, for instance, where you would need to stop down 3 or 4 stops when you start adding depth, because these are shallow depth of field settings. One of the movies that I think I'm going to make, it's going to be an extended masterclass movie, is firing off on those memories that a lot of people will use on 1, 2, and possibly 3 on the camera, and also 4 that you can keep on the card. And I do have a little movie how you can load 4 from card 2 and start using those as well. But some people think that I only actually use those settings, but I use them as starting point settings. So it's a way of just quickly getting that group of settings and then modifying as I work a particular genre. And so that the movie that I will make, that masterclass movie, is using those starting point settings, photographing things that are not perhaps in that genre, or slightly modifying 1 or 2 of those settings. For instance, my action settings are for freezing rapidly moving subjects with very fast shutter speeds, and they're not suited for creating background blur behind a subject that you're panning. Okay, so I would start modifying my action setting if that's what I wanted in that instance. Okay, so I'll just type in, because into the chat pod, so Cheryl knows. Okay, so I've just typed to Cheryl to say that she can catch this up in after the event. Okay, so that was just a local issue. Okay, so we're just moving forward on these. Okay, so a couple of portraits. This we've come onto the top of the pier into the sunlight now. What I'm doing in this particular shot is I've got Tegan's boyfriend holding a diffuser, and that diffuses the sunlight so it's not too harsh on the side of the body there. So the lighting is almost backlit, but I am just softening that sunlight up a little bit by holding a diffuser off to one side, just out of frame. I actually prefer using diffusers rather than reflectors. Okay, and this now actually I've got the without using a diffuser, I've got Tegan blocking the sun, which is directly behind her. And again, the contrast is going to be slightly high here. Now, really, I would love to have access to the raw file here, because this is going to be a lot more forgiving when I actually start post-producing this. But even with the JPEG, I can just balance that exposure a little bit. I have darkened the sky off a little bit because that would be very bright, just to create a little bit of a bookend approach to tonality on the top and the bottom of the image. Okay, so and here's one final one. The sun has set now, and so the ISO has raised, and again she's looking into the light. There's a little bit of a cover over her head, again not under the pier but in some sort of building structure on top of the pier, and again that very flattering light falling onto the face. Okay, so we'll just I'll close that up, and we'll move on to some other areas or topics that I wanted to talk about. Okay, so let's just take a look. Okay, and this one is to do with tripods. I'm not a huge fan of carrying heavy tripods. And so I'm not advocating that you all go out and buy this tripod. I've not got any links to this company, but this is a tripod that I've just purchased recently. And the interesting thing about this tripod is it is exceptionally small. It's only about a half a kilo, and it doesn't its maximum height is very, very low to the ground. And that's because most of my landscape work is captured with the tripod very, very low to the ground. I actually very rarely shoot with the legs extended on a full-size tripod. And it's always interesting when I arrive at a particular location that is well photographed by landscape photographers, how many people just extend all of the tripod legs so they can start shooting at standing height. And my starting point for any landscape shot is very close to the ground. So one would argue, why are you carrying a full-size tripod all of the time? And so you can see in relation to this camera, it's a very sturdy tripod. It's got a good ball head, but it is very, very small. And if I need to get even lower to the ground, this tripod is going to let me to do that. And you can see in the hand there, it's exceptionally portable. I'm really looking on instances, not all of the time, but in some instances, to be able to put a tripod in a messenger bag. Okay, because when I was on my last workshop in Western Australia, we were photographing dunes, and there was a lot of walking up over big sand dunes, and people were carrying their full-size tripods for the duration of the day, and typically they'd only use them for that dawn and dusk shot, and then they're just basically carrying that few kilos of metal around all day without actually using them, because as soon as we're up on top of the dunes with the sun up, everybody is more than capable of hand holding their landscape shots. And there's no reason to use extended shutter speeds to smooth water because we're on sand dunes. So I would advocate, and there is with the tripod head, it brings it up to 0.7 of a kilo. So a very light a tripod that I'll be using on location. It's this one's quite nicely built. It is carbon, but to be honest, you don't save a lot of the weight from the carbon because the legs are so short. But there is options for maybe using an attachment to add your mobile phone to the side, and there it is on the palm of a hand. Okay, so there are obviously you're playing back. You can see the model number there, the Leofoto LS223C for carbon. Okay, so that's that tripod there. Let's go back to and look at some image reviews here. Okay, so I am getting to the Flickr site where you're allowed to upload 3 images per month for critical feedback. I would request that you do ask a question, and that has started happening, because if I'm just being expected to comment subjectively on the aesthetics, then you know, I may say things that you don't agree with, and that's okay. But if it's an objective question about how do we tackle a certain thing, or what is this thing that I've just captured that I'm not too sure how that happened, then I can quite quickly objectively try and tackle this. So this was one of the last images that came in with an objective question on that Flickr forum. If you've posted an image and you've asked a question and I haven't got back to you within, say, a week, then just put something in the community forum, in the monthly Q&A forum to let me know that you have actually asked a question. I've had to actually switch the notifications off on Flickr because so many tens of thousands of people follow me on Flickr. I often miss the questions that I do want to support with this paid membership forum. Okay, so the question that went with this image was optimum settings for shooting panning. Now, typically what would happen is if you do a lot of panning with slower shutter speeds, then the My Action settings may not be ideal. You can start modifying some of the settings, but you might just want to create another memory setting specifically for panning. For instance, on my A9, on the memory card that I can drag memories from, I've got 3 settings just for action. and one of those is panning. Now, typically you are going to be slowing the shutter speed down. I might still use aperture priority, ISO auto minimum shutter speed, but instead of setting the minimum shutter speed to 2,000th of a second, I might set it to 125th or 1/250th or 1/500th. And the choice of the shutter speed is relative to the speed you're panning the camera, not to the speed of the subject matter. Something that is moving at, say, 200 miles an hour way off in the horizon, the camera is being panned very slowly, so you'd need a very slow shutter speed to create movement blur. But if that subject is much closer to the lens and you're having to pan really rapidly to keep up with your subject, then you might be using quite a fast shutter speed and still get that background blur. And when I was at, say, the motorcycle Grand Prix in Australia, I was getting significant background blur at 1/500th of a second. So you do need to play with those slow shutter speeds in order to find something that will give you the background blur. Slowing down more than you need, obviously the blur will get blurrier, but you'll find that your miss rate goes up rapidly, because you do need to be panning really quite smoothly with your subject. If the subject is changing its position in the viewfinder and you're using slow shutter speeds, you will get a blurry subject as well as a blurry background. And obviously, by trying to get those slower shutter speeds, we find that we're closing the aperture. Otherwise, we can't get those slower shutter speeds. Now, if you're using an A7R3, you can't actually close the aperture more than f8. If you're using an A7 III, the limit is f11. And if you're working with an A9, the limit is f16. And the new A7R Mark IV is also f11. So in some instances, in bright sunny weather, and this was captured in bright sunny weather, some photographers might find that they're closing the aperture down too much in order to get that slow shutter speed. And then the phase detect autofocus locks on the first image and then doesn't move on the subsequent ones in the sequence. And that is one of the big reasons, apart from panning accuracy, that your panning shots might not be as sharp as you'd hope for. And so if you can't afford the A9 for the f16 to slow the shutter speed down more, then the answer is an ND filter. And unfortunately, the filter size or thread size on these telephoto lenses that we often use for sport action, they're quite large, 72 mil, 77, 82 mil. So you are going to be spending quite a lot of money for an ND filter. I might possibly start out at an ND8 that allows you to close down 3 more stops than you would have. Well, it reduces the light 3 more stops. You don't actually close the aperture down 3 more stops, but you basically can slow the shutter speed down 3-fold by doing that. A 3-fold. So say in long terms, a 1 second exposure would become an 8 second exposure. So and everything is relative, so you will get that shutter speed, slower shutter speeds that you might need. Okay, so let's just moving forward. A couple of questions coming in about post-production. I would encourage you, I've got a big catalog of Lightroom and Photoshop movies. If you've gone and looked for the collection on the YouTube channel, you'll notice that I have hundreds of Adobe movies, and that was because I've been an Adobe ambassador for a period of perhaps 14 years or so. I'm no longer an Adobe ambassador now. They abandoned the ambassador program, but I do have a lot of back catalogue of movies. One of the movies I've created very recently outside of that ambassador deal is this 2-hour post-production movie. So if you're looking to get specific questions answered about post-production, I probably would watch this 2-hour movie first, and then if there's questions that have not been covered, then obviously put them in the forum and I'll get onto them. I also have a workflow movie for people who have who just want to get a very reliable catalog structure going. And one of the questions just in the July forum, I think it was the last question just before I signed up here to log in here, was somebody has found them, they've got multiple catalogs, and that is causing a little bit of an issue. You actually can combine catalogs. You can even create breakaway catalogs in Lightroom. So that is possible to, if you've found yourself accidentally with 2 or 3 catalogs, you can merge them together just to have a single catalog. There is an option when opening Lightroom to not go into the last catalog you were using, but to look at all of the catalogs you've created and choose which catalog you want to open. I can't go into too much detail here, but it is possible, and so we can nut that problem out, and I can possibly give you a URL so you can get that workflow working. Okay, so one of the other questions that I got in the forum very recently, I think it was next on the Flickr, somebody talking about high ISO and noise reduction, and that 2-hour Lightroom movie that I created does go in one particular section about how to my workflow for reducing noise, and that is done specifically by using a small global noise reduction, but then going in and doing the bulk of the noise reduction as a localized adjustment. Noise is most obvious in the smooth, out of focus areas, and so if you're trying to smooth out where the noise is most visible, then you don't have to do noise reduction on your subject, which will erode sharpness and detail in your subject. And so you really want to leave the subject out of the aggressive noise reduction. In this particular slide, this image was captured at 5,000 ISO, and I'm doing the localized noise reduction just where that red color is appearing there. So I'm using a radial filter and then just adding to that radial filter using the brush that's associated with the linear and radial filters. Okay, so we'll come out of that one and we'll go into the next one. Now, you probably won't find me making a movie about these 3 things I'm about to show you, because they're not Sony products, they're Sigma products. Now, common question that I often get is from Sony users who own the APS-C, the 6000, 6300, 6500, and the new 6400, is where are the new Sony lenses for this APS-C system? Now, I'm hoping Sony will bring out new lenses in this system as their cameras get more proficient in this area. But until that time arrives, I've noticed that there are 3 cracking lenses available. They're primes, but they're wide aperture primes. This is 56mm f1.4. So this pretty much behaves like an 85mm f2. So you are going to preserve your shallow depth of field even when using an APS-C lens by looking for these 1.4 primes. Obviously, when you're going into an APS-C camera, one of the things that is more difficult to achieve is shallow depth of field, because it is one of the things linked to having large sensors. We can achieve a much more shallow depth of field. So if you are trying to do that with an APS-C sensor, you do need to get even wider apertures. So these 1.4s become critical for photographers who really love that bokeh. So, and Sony have got 2 other lenses. These lenses are quite small. They're reasonably inexpensive as lenses go as well. Okay, so you might want to check these out if you do own an APS-C camera. They also have a 30mm f1.4 and a 16mm f1.4. So they've got a good somewhat the equivalent focal range. You always have to times the focal range by 1.5 to get the equivalent focal range. Okay, so this would become, say, a 24mm. and the 30mm would be your standard focal length. This would be about a 45. So we do have those three very useful primes there. I'm currently using the FE 70-200 on my APS-C cameras for a telephoto. It's got a nice f4 aperture. It's not that heavy as the telephotos go, and it behaves like a 105-300mm equivalent. Obviously, if I'm going to be using the 100-400, I actually prefer them to be on the full frame bodies. Okay, this one is just a quick look-see. I have been promoting this. I always feel slightly embarrassed sometimes when I'm promoting things. I don't, obviously not a born salesperson, but I'm pleased to announce that this is, we've got enough attendees now who people signed up. So I'm really looking forward to this adventure on the Barrier Reef in November. So I think we've got 6 people signed up. There were only 8 places. So I believe there were 1 or 2 places left. So you'll probably see me post some images towards the back end of the year, and this is very much not only about landscape. As you can see, it's a very small island, so some seascapes, but this island is thick with wildlife, both onshore and under the water, and so this will be an adventure that I'm really looking forward to. Okay, so let's just get on to these ones now. Okay, so again, for people who are interested in doing a little bit of vlogging, one of the cameras that really lends itself to vlogging is the APS-C cameras, and especially the 6400, which the screen will now tilt up 180 degrees. So you can, if you are filming yourself, you can actually see whether you're in the frame or not. One of the criticisms that came against this camera is if you put a microphone on the hot shoe, the multi-shoe, the multi-interface shoe, then that would be in front of the screen. So I didn't get too upset about this, because I know a lot of people who do vlogging, they have cages and they can mount the microphone anywhere they want. It doesn't have to be in front of the screen. But I've noticed the SmallRig have just very quickly responded to this demand in the market, and you can now just buy this like $20 bracket or whatever, and just put the microphone, in this case, on the right of the camera. And they have an alternative, is you can put the microphone on the left of the camera. Now, this is a cold shoe, so basically, if you were working with a Sony microphone that could add the audio directly to the video, that obviously isn't going to work. So you are going to need to have a microphone that has an audio jack, so you can plug that into the audio in the side of the camera, so you can preserve the audio going directly into the file there. So I just wanted to highlight that, because it really, you know, some people find very small things to criticize, and usually if there's enough demand, those slight shortcomings maybe on Sony's design aspect are quite quickly resolved by third-party manufacturers. And there is the other option of putting the microphone on the side of the camera, and obviously these are going to take up 0 space in your camera bag. And one of the microphones, if you were going to maybe look at a very small Sony microphone, and I know there will be non-Sony brands which will probably undercut the price, but this is the Sony one, and you can see here this one will lend itself to working on the multi-interface shoe, and so you don't need to work with any leads. And that's why I'm sort of showing this Sony microphone here, but it does have a mic out jack there. You can quite clearly see that. So with just a lead, if you were going to mount that on a cold shoe off to one side, then you could quite quickly add the audio in to the video file that you're recording. And as I said, this is quite a useful feature with 2 little pickup heads that you can change the angle, and obviously this will change the angle of the audio you're recording to a small degree. Okay, so we've got another 15 minutes left, so we've got a couple of things that I can cover, so we probably won't run out of time today. And that is one of the things that I'm trying to often educate people about is steady shot. Now, steady shot is a good name for this feature. It's we have steady shot inside IBIS, in-body image stabilization, on some of the cameras, but not all of the cameras. The A6400 doesn't have steady shot inside. So if you were going to be hand holding that camera for video work or in low light, you are going to have OSS lenses where the steady shot is in the lens. Some Sony lenses don't have steady shot in the lens, so you really need to have it in the body if you're trying to handhold using slow shutter speeds. The issue becomes a little bit more complex because a lot of people just leave steady shot on all of the time, but there is a very good reason on the premium lenses is why we can switch steady shot off. And now if you have steady shot on off on the lens, if you switch it off on the lens, it automatically switches it off if you have a Sony camera with IBIS steady shot inside. If you are using a lens with steady shot, you'll find the steady shot options grayed out on the camera. So basically the lens and the camera are talking with each other when we have steady shot settings on both. Now, if you're doing very erratic motion with fast shutter speeds because you're tracking sports, there is absolutely no reason to have steady shot on. So really you should be turning steady shot off on the lens or the camera if you don't have that available on the lens, because you're not trying to keep the camera and lens steady, you're actually moving the camera, and steady shot will fight against you. It won't work with you when you're trying to create those pin sharp images. Now there is another option on the white Sony lenses where you have steady shot modes. Now, typically they come out of the box with mode 1, which is ideally suited for, again, trying to keep the camera absolutely steady with a slightly slower shutter speed, handheld. Now, but if you're panning the camera, there is the option to go, instead of switching steady shot off, you can use mode 2, which disables the horizontal steady shot. So it is telling the camera, I intend to move the camera from left to right or right to left, basically panning. And so you can try and smooth my horizontal pan out for me. I'm going to let you do that. So that is one option. But again, if the motion becomes erratic, if the camera starts going up and down, on some of the most recent Sony lenses, they have mode 3, which is designed for. If you don't have a mode 3, just switch steady shot off. The other reason to switch steady shot off is if these longer lenses start going onto tripods, you should really switch the steady shot off, because the optical stabilization in the lens, if it has it, is going to cause a small amount of vibration when the lens camera is mounted on the tripod, and that vibration over a longer shutter speed is going to be quite noticeable in the fact that you're not going to get a pin sharp image. And so that is another reason to turn steady shot off. And of course, one of the underlying problems here is as soon as you're packing away, you sort of have to remember to put it back on, because the steady shot, when you are trying to keep your camera very still, is obviously a very important feature. Okay, so do I turn steady shot off for your dog action shots? And the answer is, if I'm panning left or right, the answer is mode 2. But if my shutter speeds are well up there, you know, like 2,000ths per second, there is no reason to even have it on mode 2. You might as well just switch steady shot off. Okay, steady shot really is about slow shutter speeds. So where mode 2 would become really important is when you're using the slower shutter speeds for maybe a little bit of panning blur, and then that would be quite useful. But you might as well just turn it off. I think a lot of fast action, you know, you just turn it off. Okay, so because you're not going to actually be using that steady shot. Okay, just remember to turn it back on when the lens goes back in the bag, or if you're only ever doing action at fast shutter speeds, just leave it off. Okay, so that was a good question there, Greg. Okay, so that's another lens that is not a Sony. So again, I did actually create a small movie review for this one, and that is I actually own the 12-24 FE, and that's is like super wide. It's actually a very challenging lens to use, and I wouldn't promote everybody who's interested in landscape go out and buy a 12 to 24 for a full frame sensor. Your hero elements in the landscapes can look very, very far away, so you sort of have to get very close to something in the middle distance or foreground to make these shots really work. And so it is very challenging. Having said that, people who will gravitate to these lenses are people who may be doing architecture or real estate, interiors, where if you ever found yourself with your back against the wall and you can't get the entire room in view, and you really don't want to be panoramic stitching everything you shoot, then these ultra wide angle lenses certainly serve a purpose, but they are specialist gear. Now, one of the things that these ultra wide angle lenses all share in common is the bulbous front element, and this really makes it quite challenging to put filters on these lenses, and the 12-24 Sony doesn't actually have a filter thread. So again, a third-party filter manufacturer, Nissi in my instance, came to the party, created a cage that goes over the non-removable lens hood, and then you can put your big 150mm square filters in front of the camera. Now, when Laowa approached me and said, would you like to review this lens, I actually didn't need the focal length because I already had the focal length, but I was interested in looking at this lens for a couple of reasons. One, it went even wider than 12. This starts at 10mm on a full frame. It's a 10-18 zoom. It doesn't have an ultra-wide aperture, so it's of very little interest to astrophotographers, but it would be of great interest maybe to real estate. Now, it doesn't have autofocus, but that's not really a great issue with these ultra-wide angle lenses. You tend just to use your hyperfocal distance, and everything at f11 is going to be pin sharp without worrying about focus. And the second feature that I was most interested in about this particular lens, one, it's small. It's not actually that light because it's quite a heavy construction, but it is small, so if you're trying to get extra gear in a gear bag, it's going to be smaller than the 12-24. But more importantly, there was an interesting design feature in that you can get a 10-stop ND filter for this particular lens made by Laowa that fits on the just behind the rear element. So it's a tiny filter. I can't remember the dimension, whether it's 20 or 30 something millimeters. It's quite a small filter. Only downside, having said that, there are very few filter manufacturers who make low profile filters this small. I'm hoping that this is a design feature, however, that is going to become more popular, because big filters cost an awful lot of money, and very tiny filters that take up zero room in your filter bag and you can put behind the lens before you attach the lens certainly is a very interesting design feature. So I was really interested in taking a look at this lens. It's we've got just a few minutes left, so we've got probably this might be the last one here that we deal with today before I sign off, and I'll just say the other ones for later. And that is when I'm making tutorial movies, I'm very aware that if I'm talking about video, often I'm using a frame rate that people in America or the US are not actually seeing. In America, if the cameras are set up to shoot video in America, you have options of 24 frames per second, which is typically the frames per second that Hollywood shoots in, 24 frames per second. And then you'll have 30 and 60, and obviously then there's the high frame rates like 100 and 120 or whatever. But typically the 24 and 30 is very much American. That's NTSC, and then there's the frame rates that in different regions of the world, which is PAL, and I'm typically choosing between 25 and 50. I don't get the option for 24. Now you can switch the camera over. There is an option in the menus to switch between NTSC and PAL. So really the slide is, would you do that? Okay, and the answer is only if you really need to. Now, the reason that these differences occur is because of the power frequencies, the differences in power frequencies, the grid frequencies in these countries. And the idea is that certain frame rates you're safe to shoot in introduced lighting, such as fluorescent lights or incandescent lights, where you won't get those lights flickering. Now, if you were to go international travel and started filming in an area that was not NTSC and you didn't change your camera over, you might experience flickering lights in your video clips. Now, and if that is something that you're going to do, you either switch over to the PAL because you're in a PAL area, or you download an app for your mobile phone that tells you the shutter speeds that you can use safely without having or experiencing that flicker. So that's just something to be wary of. Like in your own country, just there's no real need to change your settings. But if you are traveling, then you're given two options: change your settings so you're safe, or download the app to your phone that tells you which shutter speeds you can use safely. Okay, so there is the NTSC-PAL selector in the menus there we can see. Now, if you go into this one, you do have to be wary that the camera will reboot. You really want to make sure all of the information on your memory card is backed up before you reboot in the alternative system, because I'm not going to guarantee that the files you've already recorded are going to be preserved. Okay, I don't know what actually has to happen here. Maybe somebody who does this more often will be able to tell you why the camera needs to reboot to do this. But it does say in this warning screen it is necessary to format. Okay, and that makes me a little bit nervous if you've got existing information on your memory card that hasn't been pulled off yet. Okay, so we've just come to the end of the 1 hour. So let's just, I'll just pull this back up and I'll hit stop broadcast. Okay, so